So I know weeks ago I said that I was going to keep working on that forest floor, but I injured myself playing soccer, and I have a standing desk, and I didn't give myself enough room to do a chair, so kind of at the point where I can stand and use it. See how long I can go, but to do something a little bit shorter and something that I've wanted to do, I'm going to do a Wetness utility. So I've started working on it. I figured, hey, might as well stream it. Let me set up some switches here. We can compare the two. Expose. Switch. That's fine. Switch grayscale. Height. Height. And height. This way we'll be able to switch between things. Inclusion. Alex always black. Roughness. Okay. Save this. Clean this up. Okay, so in the hey Punk, in the substance default one, that is just like a water level where it adds puddle to stuff. You can see that here in this water level. So we can turn the water darkness up, which what this is doing is just basically moving between black. But that's not what happens when things get wet. They don't turn black. Like this is what our base color looks like. They get darker. So what we actually have in here, which this doesn't have waterline yet, I just started working on it. The texture, turn this off, gets darker. So currently I'm plugging this in. So we'll do levels. If I wanted to get fancy, I would do this probably. So this waterline will control this wetness. So you can see the areas that are getting darker. That is what actually happens when something gets wet. So if you think about like a sponge, both darker and more saturated. So if you think about a sponge getting wet, like a yellow sponge, it's like a light yellow, and then it gets wet and it gets darker and more saturated. So there have been a bunch of articles and things. Let me see if I can find one. I want to say it's Lagarde. Yeah. Okay, I'll share this link in here. So it's a really great like exploration of what the world looks like when it gets wet and how the colors change, and then how we can approximate that from a game perspective, because trying to do it accurately is really difficult. It's really expensive. So how do we approximate that? And put this in here. So that's what I've started to do, is go through and start making this wetness utility. So one of the things that he talks about in the article is the idea of porosity, which is how much microsurface is on the object, which the water is just going to kind of run into and fill in. And then at a certain point, you're going to start seeing the water because it's totally full. So all these microsurfaces that happen, the water gets in there, it starts refracting the light, so less of the light gets out. And then because it's water, different wavelengths, so we end up with this kind of darkening and saturating of the surface. So the substance one doesn't have porosity, and it doesn't do the darkening the way that it's supposed to, and I don't like the way that it handles fringe. There's like a surface tension that's supposed to happen with the water, and capillary action, which kind of pull the water up on the edges, where it interacts with the non-puddled surface. So if you look at the normal here, it doesn't really have that. It's pretty much just a cutoff. And if we look at the height, I can change our water level here a little bit. It's just moving up through the layer, basically. And there isn't this idea of like surface tension in here. It doesn't feel like it's actually filling it up. It's just this line. So it doesn't feel like it's actually interacting with the surface that's there. So those are all things that I don't like. So I'm working on my own. There are a few other dimensions that I wanted to take into account, and that's slope. So when a surface is perfectly flat, the water can just collect on top of that. But when it's angled, the water is going to flow and it's going to want to accumulate in areas that are lower. So the water level is in the substance node is just kind of filling up the height map. So it's just kind of moving up through the height map. But I want the wetness that happens outside of that water. So it makes it feel like we have runoff where it's kind of running down and collecting in the lower areas. I want the sloped portion to be less wet than the flat portions. So we take a normal input. We can probably take a height stuff once we get to the puddly stuff. Our base color, our glossiness or roughness, and then that's currently, those are all the dimensions that we're using. So in the article, physically based wet surfaces 3A. And then Naughty Dog also did a talk on how they did their wetness. But basically, it's a square of the color for the transformation that happens. Gives a pretty good approximation. But you don't want to do it on the sRGB because then you start ending up with the color getting messed up due to the fact that you have a gamma curve in sRGB. So you want to turn it to linear so that you can then square it and then switch it back. I can show an example of why you don't want to do that. Why you don't just want to take the square of it. So we're going to make this a really vibrant rainbow. Push our saturation a little bit. So we're kind of capping out in these colors right now. They can't really move much more than getting white. So if we do regular POW and then square it, so power of 2, and then we look at the difference between these two. a little hard to see. Let's see if we can shift these a little bit, make it a little bit more obvious. Come on, buddies. There we go. This isn't a great example, but I figured just having a range would be enough. These gradients will start to tighten up if you just do the PAL to 2 instead of, oh here, we'll turn it up. Let's see if we can. And then with compression, I don't know how well it's going to translate. Anyway, that's the way that the math works. So we want to work in linear when we can. So that's what this is, converted to linear, and these are all substance built-in nodes. So convert to linear, square it, convert it back to sRGB, and then blend it over the base color based on where the wetness is. So then we take our normal and we strip out the blue channel, because that's basically all the areas that kind of come up to, and their shape. The blue is going to kind of give us that piece. Let's do an example. Piece that's angled, which is like a kind of cheap way to take info that we already have and reuse it. So if I crank this normal up, so this is basically all the like angled areas. And then I'm doing an auto levels on it. So we have basically all the slopes based on however the material has been tuned. So we don't make any assumptions using a height map. This is basically what the artist is given, and then we auto levels to get the maximum range, because we're exposing how much that actually affects it. And then we take that and we use a non-uniform blur to blur the areas that are more wet, so that it flattens those areas out. And then these elements are all like advanced features. What these are basically, over the wetness continuum, there's a point where the material is absorbing the water, so you're not seeing a change in gloss, and then it gets saturated and it doesn't darken anymore. And then it starts getting glossy. So this is the gloss section, and this is the diffuse section. That is trying to find the section. I guess in section 1, there's an image that shows a mostly dry surface, but it still has that darkening. So yeah, if you go to the page and then you scroll down in section 1 to when drying, specular strength disappears faster than the darkening of the diffuse. That is a very keen observation. So the darkening happens really quick before the gloss and specular changes change. So I set up some advanced parameters in the technical section, because generally these are fixed, but you could change where those points happen in your kind of wetness continuum. But what I have currently is porous materials reach their max darkness at 0.35 wetness, and non-porous materials reach their max at 0.15. Because it's less porous, it gets to its peak faster because there are fewer pores to be filled up by the water. And then the gloss is basically, there's a point where the gloss stops moving because it's filled up with water, and then you're just kind of increasing the amount of water on that surface. And I could do special cases for things that are hydrophobic or macroporous, where they'll hold an infinite amount of water or zero water, but I don't have that currently. And then things that are non-porous are affected less than, as far as the diffuse goes, than things that are porous, because they're not actually kind of getting in there and filling everything up. It's just kind of forming a layer, and that layer is often thin, like something like marble or granite, for example. When water gets on the surface, it kind of fills in the little holes, and then it just gets really shiny toward whatever the shininess level of water is, which I should also expose. So this is going to be that in the technical section, because whatever I set this to, it should be correct. Currently it's 0.85, which is gloss, which I don't want. So this will invert based on whether it's a gloss input. And then this, so if I'm doing roughness, I'm going to set it to something really low. If I'm doing gloss, I'm going to set it to something really high. And then I want to invert it. Yeah, that should be fine. So that way the user can think in whatever way is comfortable for them, and then it should just work. I'm going to set this really low because we're working in roughness. Okay, so then if we go back here to the testing area, and then we'll switch this back. So currently what's happening is we're getting, what, most of this wet? Yeah, most of this is getting super wet. So it's kind of getting lumpy. So then we could change how much normal flattening we do. We could do 0. We could do a little bit. And then our slope wetness reduction, which helps a lot with things that are fuzzy, like this. So we can go above 1. We can basically go up to 2. And then that kind of changes the angle requirement for it to not work. And then we are giving it roughness. What the? Oh. Forgot to put the visible if. Move this up. Grab this. Because we don't want the advanced parameters showing up unless the user has said, you know what, I want to see this. This. Okay. So then, as we change our water level here, we can see that those areas are getting properly wet. And then that's being based off the, not that one, this roughness. So this moss is considered pretty porous, so it's not getting as shiny. You can see that it is shiny, but it doesn't get as shiny as like the sticks. I'm trying to find an example where we have a mix of, and the sticks are actually low enough. The sticks are all on top. Alright, maybe it'll work. So these branches, they're considered 100% wet as far as the input goes. And they were just comparing how much their color changes. It doesn't change very much, because those are lower roughness, so they're considered less porous. So they won't darken up as much as the moss would. So we could put this in here, and that gives us a better color of what would happen if things actually get wet versus this. So if we take our water darkness all the way down, it's like a clear coat basically, when really it should look like this when it gets wet. So the way that the water line works is basically a value that you're setting via the level, and then it's just doing a height blend. So we can add another grayscale input. This is going to be our height. Then I'm going to blend that with max, because if the water is above the height map, then it needs to fill in the areas that are lower. And then we need a color. We're just going to expose this. And some of you might be wondering, oh, why don't you just use the value node? I could, but I want to keep this engine, more engine agnostic. I don't want to have the engine 7, especially if I wanted to take this to work. Okay, so this is going to fill our height map with water, and then we need to do another blend to get the difference. I'm going to set this as output. We're just going to call this our mask. This is our height map. Our wet height. So then we need another switch. Oh wait, no, we can use the same switch. We'll switch this to true. It's coming out black because I'm not giving it a height map, but I am giving it a height map. Okay. And then we're just going to link these together for now. We're going to expose this and then link the water line to the water level. Okay, so currently we're not doing anything to the normal, which is issue. But let's check our mask. That's giving us all the stuff that's above the water at the same value that it is, which we might want to histogram scan it. Let me use editing context. So here, we probably want to histogram scan so we can get a higher contrast mask out of it. And then thinking about the best way to put the flat normal in. I think so then the normal looks like this, which is basically what we have in the other water level node. Oops. Okay. We got this mask, this mask. They're inverse of each other. This mask is where the water is, which we could do too, but it's fine. So we got flat, 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 AO. I could not use AO. The moss won't look as good, but it's okay. So this is algorithmic, this is mine. So one of the things that we need to do is basically change some of the information. So this is what our wetness is. So we need to make sure that where the water is 100%. Wet. So then that would be max. And then I'd want to invert this. But not that way. And then where the water is, the gloss just needs to be that. So then there's all the other stuff that we did, but we don't really care about that. We need to make sure that the gloss is, or roughness, is what it should be. Okay. Switch it back. There's still this like lumpiness. Height is flat because our mask, which should be basically the same as this. It's all flat. Oh, I inverted the masks, and I need to invert the normals. There we go. Okay. So now we have a water line that behaves similarly. The roughness of our water is different. Okay. The roughness on the substance water level node is 0. So, okay, so one of the things that we currently have is that we have our water. It's darkening the stuff and saturating the stuff underneath the water, which is good. Because we're using this mask, which we have like this fringe wetness, we're seeing areas that are dark and starting to get shiny but not flattened out by the normals. We do need to get the pucker that would happen on the edge. So the histogram scan on the mask kind of does that. But we would need 2 separate ones, one for the edge and one for the water. or we would need to histogram scan it again. If we make it really contrasty, this is basically precisely where the water is. And then if we wanted to give it an edge, we could use something like edge detect or distance, which is probably a better option. So distance will kind of allow us to push that wetness out from where the water is. So we'll use that. And to give it a better slider, probably want to divide it or multiply it or something. So a water fringe. So we're gonna multiply by 256, and then we'll adjust the levels. So we're going to say 0 to start, max is 1. We're going to clamp it up. Yep. So I'm going to, this is our wetness, add the puddles. And then we got to add the fringe. Max. So then we'll go back here. And the fringe. We're going to bring the water line down a little bit. Now I only have a few puddles in here. And I'm going to get rid of this wetness input. So it's just the puddle wetting it, and then we can actually see the water line and water fringe. So then we have this fringe coming out. Really low numbers, it moves really quick. So I probably don't want to do 256. I probably want to do like, or not even that, maybe just leave it. Okay, that feels better. The way that the slider feels. You have no fringe. You start to get some fringe. And it dies off. So the fringe that we're putting in, this, is linear. Just whoop. But we don't really want that. We want it to climb like up a slope appropriately. So if it's super steep and we say, okay, the water's here so the water can kind of pull itself up against gravity using capillary action, that's what's causing that wetness. the steeper it is, the less that water is actually going to be able to climb up it, as opposed to something like this where it can just kind of get pulled because it's not fighting gravity as much. So that's this piece here. So we basically want to multiply this So we're just going to look at the view here, see how that looks. That's pretty cool. But we should probably also use the height map for this. So we have the angle, but then we also want to use the height map so that we have a better idea of distance. So because it's linear and it's totally ignoring the actual distance. So we look at the angle, which is basically how difficult this is going to be. So we're multiplying that in. And then how far is this as far as the height map goes? We kind of get that by virtue of the angle. If the angle is really steep, then that distance is pretty far. But we do want it to kind of like gravitate toward the lower areas and bear the angle in mind as well. So we have our height map, we have the histogram scan, which tells us exactly where the puddles are, and then we have this distance from where the puddle is out. We could use curvature to push it toward the lower areas. Let's just see what the height map does if we multiply it. So there's like puddle in here, looks like puddle in here. So it feels like we need to take the post combined and then auto levels it because the water line will be the lowest point because we're blending it in max. So then we're just getting the distance from the water up. And then we'd want to do a subtract rather than a multiply. So these shapes, so like these leaves, this little like plant clump here, is much higher, and then we kind of have this. I'm going to turn this scale up. that doesn't do anything. We're at high enough tessellation that it's good. Okay, so looking at how tall these shapes are, like this stick that's sticking way up, these little plant clumps. And we turn this up. It's kind of pulling that water back down to where it should be. So if you have a piece that's sticking way above, this barely above. Now I gotta look for one that's like quite a bit higher, but right next to. So here's a good example. So we have a little puddle in here, and then we have these large shapes around it. See how this is just getting wet, regardless? We turn this up, and it's pulled it off of that, and that's kind of staying down in the moss. So this feels more natural to me. So then a good test is going to be, if we turn that fringe up, those areas should still stay fairly dry, which it looks like they do. Because the water is creeping out from this puddle out here. See how the stick doesn't actually get more wet? Let's look at the wet color. Let's see, where are we in the map? We are here. So let's see how that looks. So it's wet, and it's not wet. So then change this fringe down, kind of stays the same level of dryness. So then we have properly behaving water. So the way that it kind of creeps out and goes up the stuff is correct based on where it's accumulating. So then we don't really have a fringe, right? We just kind of have this water that goes bonk, and then these pieces shoot out. Like it's more obvious here, right? Where you're just kind of seeing it stretch on the polygons. But we want that like for real. So we have our mask. This is where all the water is. So we could do an edge detect on this. Really small edge. So this I feel like we need kind of a distance field type thing. So let's see if we can do something with distance rather than edge detect. So we want a pretty small distance. So we'll do the same thing. Oh, yeah, this needs to be a binary because we're building our own fringe. It needs to basically be a black or white is at 0.99. We have these kind of edge, but we don't really want that because it's kind of causing this little bit of weirdness. You want it to be even and go exactly to where it's blending, and then we can smooth the edge over, and it makes this mask much nicer. So 0.99, yuck, 1, nice. So then basically what we need to do is blur these over. And this could go in the technical parameters, I guess. This should give us a little bit more of that water creeping. So it's pulling the pieces down. I don't necessarily like that. Really, I want to kind of pull the water up. I want to bridge this gap. Yes. Basically, what the histogram is doing is this a levels node that's kind of like sliding these sliders around. So this is what the histogram is at 1. And it will always give you a binary mask because the color can either be black or white. So this is all white. And then if we change the midpoint around on this, well, I guess always is really hard to say. No, it doesn't always. Because you can see that there's some gray in here. Compare it to a histogram scan. And these are the same result. And no, there is some gray, so no, it's not always binary. If we wanted to make it binary, then you probably have to use a pixel processor. Let's see. Is it worth it? It's pretty quick. Maybe I'll replace this so I know that I'm working with a binary mask. Yeah, it's a good point. I appreciate you pointing it out. Now I'm actually curious. There's the height blend node, which is basically this. Like if we take this and this and blend them, we get a mask. Nope. Because that's using a histogram scan or levels. Yeah, it's a really, really good point. Because we want it to be as binary as possible to help with that edge. Because we're going to, it'll be rough, but then we blend it out with all the other operations that we're doing with like the normal blend and all this. So, to blend these, basically, I'm going to mask the height map. So I want the water to creep up. So then I would be blending the height map here back into the water. And probably a blurred version of it. But we'll just try without that. So I'm going to take the height map, the original height map, blended it underneath based on this one. Okay, so this distance is way too much. Now it's depressing in here, which is not quite what we want. We could also do this, which is going to take the water level and pull it up. Just giving a similar result as the blur, but is much cheaper. And we can change the profile of this. So we can increase the distance, but then change the shape. Yeah. Okay. So this is basically before, after. So then we'd need to do the same thing on the normal map. That's helping to kind of bring the water up on the edge, which is nice. Okay, now we got a total mess. Clean it up. This should probably be converted into a node. Like you're pointing out Ponk. Okay, so now the water spreads in the surface more realistically, this fringe. And then we should probably have a contrast for it, because this one has a contrast for it, as this distance. I guess no, it doesn't. It just says distance. Huh. Okay, well, we could. Well, we don't need to change the contrast because that's kind of handled by just changing the distance. We can change the contrast. So that's this one. So make sure that these are the same. It should be. And then I would expose that. Okay. Let's make Ponk's node. I'm going to make a new substance. What are histograms? Input, output, easy peasy. Output. Okay, so the position, which is a great idea, is basically the cutoff point where if the value is less than the position, then turn it white. So we're basically going to make a histogram scan that gives us black or white. So let's just validate the behavior. So position, basically, if the value is greater than 1 minus, less than or equal to 1 minus. think that's the correct math. But we'll test it, because you always test it. Currently position is at 1, we want it to be 0. Not correct. We want something like this. If our value okay, so the math was correct. I just did it wrong. I had it right, and then I switched it. So it's not correct. But the thinking is correct. So what's interesting about the histogram scan is that when you bring the position up, you're basically going from white down. So that's the 1 minus. Is like the value that's in here needs to be close to white if my position is really low. So it's going 1 minus. So if the value is greater than, if 1 minus is greater than the value in here, then turn it white. And it's yes or no. There's no in between with this node. So I'm going to call it histogram binary and save it into my substance library. Call it that. And then www. I think that's what it is. Filter. Oh, messed up my default. I could not clamp it and then use it with 32-bit, I guess. Oh, dang it. Boom. Thank you for the suggestion, pointing that out. And then just made a quick pixel processor node, which if you guys are scared of the pixel processor, don't be. It's super powerful and pretty easy to use. Basically what it's going to do is look at every single pixel and do something. So all we're doing here is we look at every single pixel. So where am I in the image? What's that pixel information? I have a parameter, 0 to 1, and then we want to look at the high points, so we do 1 minus. And then if that value is less than or equal to that pixel value, then turn it to white. This is black or white, 0 or 1, true or false. And then this just turns it to a float. So 0.0 and 1.1. So just shoop, go through. Easy peasy. Okay, we're going to edit this in context. This true. Looks like something broke. Height map is broken. Oh, it breaks at 1, turns white. I have greater or lower or equal, which it should not be. It should just be lower. Okay, there we go. Because if it's equal, then it will include black. So if it's turned to 1, and 1 minus 1 is 0, so it's lower or equal, then that means if it's black, it is equal to 0, which means that it will include black in the histogram scan. So you can't do or equal, because if you turn it to 1, then it includes the black, and it turns the whole thing white, which is not what we want. You want basically everything up to 0, but not including. Okay. So now we have the water puckering slightly, but I think what might be a better way to do it would be to pull the water back from the edge slightly. So we're going to turn this off for a sec. Just look at the normal map. This one actually. As long as it doesn't feel like it's dipping, I want it to feel like Okay, yeah, do that. So one of the things that we're not doing that the water level node is doing is that we have sludge that we can turn on. Switch it back here. Which is basically how much of that water is like an extra thing. Um, which is a little hard to tell, but it looks like it is fraction of the height map that the puddle is in. So our water line right now is 0.5. So we should see sludge depth before we get to 0.5. Or rather, we should see sludge when our sludge depth is not yet 0.5. Which we do. Starting to see it in here. So it's basically filling it up with a second waterline type thing. But based on just the color in the height map. That allows you to kind of muddy the puddles. Thing that would be cool would be if the sludge was based kind of on the type of material that was under it. Or there's a porosity multiplier in the sludge opacity. Well, let's just see if we can recreate the sludge 100% opacity and depth. So I want to see if I can get this look and this one. So I'm going to need to do a color and expose it. I'm going to call it silver. And that's just going to get blended based on this. And our default color for it, what's this up? Default color is going to be something similar to what they have. Cool. Easy peasy. Done. I will be right back. Right. So what this feels like is this multiplied with a height map, which may be auto level. I don't know. So, just looking with this, it's kind of filling up from the bottom, where we get like more silt in the bottom. So, I'm basically taking the mask, multiplying it so that we're doing it only in the water area, and then inverting and histogram scanning, which is basically like how much of that. It's almost like the invert blur stuff needs to happen here, and then that gets histogram scanned. And then there's this non-uniform blur component to it. I'm messing with it and seeing if I like the way that it's behaving. Feels like that the non-uniform blur needs to be based on like the water depth. Where the silt is more like detailed in the deeper areas and less detailed in the shallow areas. But I could just ditch it entirely. And then I get this kind of really high detail. Silt, which kind of feels a little bit weird. So it feels like these pieces need to kind of move like inverse. Like as there's more silt, it feels like there needs to be less contrast. Just kind of feels better. So now we need a parameter for it. So we have our silt color, our silt depth, and then we're going to make a function for it, I think, to try to get that inverse relationship that like it feels better. So like when the silt is down here, it's like we need higher contrast. Like that feels pretty good, but then once you get to your position, then that contrast is too much. The contrast needs to be down here. So they kind of flip, but the relationship is going to be a little bit complicated. Do function, we're going to get float, and then this is our silt depth. I'm going to do 1 minus, set this, sequence, this we're going to do contrast. And then in here, get that float. Okay. Then out here, all right, needs to be inverted. So it's really this, maybe. Okay, so it's not exactly a 1 minus. We can't just invert it. So we're going to linearly interpolate based on the silt depth. So currently it's 1. And then we'd want our contrast to be 0 based on the little test that we did. And then our max contrast that we kind of had was 0.8. And then the depth's probably fine. Wait, why is it going down? It's really low. That should be correct. Oh, oh, because I freaking reversed these. Like a silly goose. The last is the thing that's actually kind of the output. Okay. So 0.75, it's basically a max. Okay, that feels better than smooth step. We could square it so that it takes longer in the lower values. X to the n. Smooth step, I believe, is a ease in, ease out. You can look. Let's find out. Interesting. Just do this. Does that? Yeah, that's an ease in, ease out. So it goes in and then out. I'm trying to kind of figure out the right relationship between these. Because it shows up, it's basically non-existent in here. Okay, so we're getting some silt, and then it's like crazy. So that's why I'm thinking, oh, maybe this. So we're at 1. Oh, we need to do 1 minus. These aren't working opposite each other. It's probably part of it. The contrast should be 0.2, should be 0.2 between 0 and 0.8. Quarter of the way, so it should be like 0.2. So we want high contrast when it's low. Ugh. Okay, why is this stumping me so hard? Okay. So we kind of want them to move opposite. So currently that's being done by reversing the inputs. So when the silt depth is 0, the contrast is really high. And it should probably just be 1. And then I might as well do a 1 minus, but. And then our position, we probably don't want to go above 0.75. I'm just going to control the numbers here. Oops. This one's 0. This one's 1. So they're just going to move straight opposite each other. Contrast is super high. Okay, so I think the starting point, we should probably move it up. Yay! Okay, that feels decent for the way that that behaves. Alright, Pomp, take it easy. Thanks. You can always watch the recording if you're curious. And thanks again for the tip. From the great Ben Wilson. Okay, so I do want to add a silt against porosity. Or I don't need to. So this has a silt, or a sludge as they call it, opacity. Which just like remultiplies it. But you get some weird effects. And I feel like a better version of that would be using porosity to change how sludgy something is. So if the porosity is really low, then it's not going to like pick dirt up off the surface because there is no dirt. Or it's not going to pick up as much, and it's going to wash away more quickly in low porous materials. Something like marble may get a dirt or dust layer on it, but then when it gets wet, then that washes off really quick and the dirt isn't going to kind of stay there. So I'm thinking is that we could subtract the porosity and then expose this as our silt needs starting to pop me. So things that can actually absorb the silt. Is that the right way to think about it? If the silt can kind of sink into the surface, that's irrelevant. It's not going to like absorb it. This is still going to sit on top of the surface. So let's say it's an entryway to like a building in Washington, D.C. where it's like marble or granite or limestone, something like that. It's relatively smooth. You get a puddle, and there's dirt, and then the dirt gets suspended into the water. It's just going to hang out. There probably wasn't much mud to begin with, because it easily gets blown off. So the more porous the thing is, the more likely silt is to be there. So if it's a stone, then the color is going to be less, I think. I think that's a logical way to think about it. So then frost. I don't want to do frost in this because I want to do a snow version where I can freeze a thing. And then if there's water in it, then it would turn that to ice with frost on the edges. So we have our edge wetness distance with our fringe depth blur. What is depth blur? Let's take a look. Let's turn our sludge all the way up, reduce the level a little bit. Oh wait, no, we don't want any sludge. No sludge. What is this depth blur amount? Oh, it just blurs the diffuse underneath. That's useful, super useful for like ice stuff. It's the opacity. This is weird because it feels like a double control. So I have my amount, and then opacity, which feels really weird because I can achieve the same effect by having the opacity at 1 and just changing my blur amount. Weird. Okay. I am going to implement this slightly differently. It's obviously using a non-uniform blur because we get those telltale like thorn shapes. So if you turn the amount way up and you look in here, the way that this is, like this type of shape happens from non-uniform blur versus like a high quality blur. So we are going to use a non-uniform blur. It's going to go before the silt. But we're going to do it based on water depth, and we're just going to have a single control. So this is my height map. This is where the water is. So this is basically where the water is with the height map inverted, which is what we want. So we're going to use that as our blur map. I'm just thinking about whether or not it should be run through like an auto levels to elongate the range. So we're going to do no silt. And then lots of samples. One, it just turns it pretty much into mush. So if I do an auto levels here, the intensity goes up. Do an auto levels here, okay, so what I really want is the depth of the water. So I need to take the height of the water and the height map and subtract. So in the areas where the water is visible, that means the water is higher than the height map. So I want to take the water height and then subtract the height map. So that will give me basically the water depth. Yeah. And then just to make sure that we're dealing with the areas that actually have water, and then we use that mask. Which it turns out that that just works here because of the fact that this is negative. These black areas are negative. So I don't actually need to do that. And then I want to blur with that. So the deeper it is, the blurrier it gets, because you're kind of looking through more water. So in the areas where it's really shallow on the edge, we should have less. And then we have our edges over here. So this is the extra where the water kind of comes up. So I guess we probably don't want to blur there. I'm just thinking about getting this to integrate a little bit better. Like, this is super blurry and this is not blurry. It's not exactly what I want. It just looks really artificial. So I'm thinking about the inverse. So then I would subtract this. To help blend that a little bit better. That looks a little better. So for performance, since I'm going to put a levels in, I don't need to invert it. The height is 8-bit. Oh, yikes. I think I don't want to do that. Wait, why is it 8-bit? 16. Base is 8. Oh, okay. So that's a good thing to note, is that when doing relative to parent input, the default material matters. So I want to set my height map as the default input. Because that's where we get our bit depth from. This. Set as primary. This doesn't matter. Okay, so now we should be able to keep our bit depth. Yeah! Okay, because we're like getting a really bad stair stepping. It's like, whoa, what's going on? Okay. Okay. So for performance, I noticed the banding in here when I inverted it. We invert, but then we also want to do a levels on it. So it works a lot better to get rid of this invert because I can invert it in the levels and adjust the levels. Okay, and this blur is cranked up way higher than I would normally go. And it looks pretty good. We do 1, and then we get this kind of nice depth blur. As there are more and more layers, that water, or I guess there are more and more millimeters of that water. And then it'd be useful for the frost stuff. So we'll expose this. We're going to call this depth blur. And then I'm going to do some organization. So we have fringe contrast. I don't even remember what fringe contrast was. Oh yes, I remember what it is now. Fringe contrast. Okay. Waterline fringe. could get fancy and say that this is only visible if it's greater than 0. Which would then do this. Reduce our water level a little bit. We're getting most of it wet. So we got to put some reasonable limits on these as we continue to work through the names. So we have a silk color. Silk depth should be above there. Okay, silk color, depth. Alright, this needs some organization, but it's okay for now. Oh, weird. So I'm just doing a comparison between these two, the substance one and mine. And it's interesting to look at the difference. Definitely need to adjust my normal flattening formula because it should probably be pretty low. But so you can see the difference here where it's actually like blending the water onto the material a little. Because I have the reduce slope wetness. And then the way that my fringe works is different. Like this is a lot more just like even value, just cover it up, while this retains a lot more of like the value that was there, which is part of the porosity functionality. Like these giant flat values and then leaning on the normal to help keep that from breaking down. So this setting up the fringe, things get like pretty soupy without the slope wetness reduction. Especially with this kind of moss material. Ooh, just found a bug. So you can overdrive this to 2, which basically says all slopes. That also affects the stuff that's underwater, which means that this needs to be before this. So I'm pretty sure. This is the wetness of water. So take, I don't want to do that. Yeah, I just want to do this, and then this, and then this. There we go. So we reduce the wetness on the slopes unless there's water there, then we don't. Yeah, because that's just our base wetness. because we can do 0 waterline. Turn that to 0. It's not wet. And then we can just give it a map. And then it makes it wet. Then I got this wet ground. So the porosity piece, if you look here, how this is shiny, and then we have this dark edge. We're not using fringe or anything like that, right? So we'll take this off, we'll take fringe off. No silt. That's just happening based on the way that the wetness and porosity works. So when the wetness is really low, it's just darkening the material. It doesn't make it shiny yet. Here, in these areas that are really wet, it's starting to get shiny. And then if we make it really wet, then we get all these really shiny pieces. There's very little fall off. Here you can see overall it's pretty dark, and then we have these few pockets. So we could bring the max wetness down a little bit. And we start to get some shiny areas, but mostly it's just dark. And then it feels like damp ground, as opposed to the water line, which just covers it with water, and you don't have control over like, just making it wet. So you can bring up the base wetness. It's just going to start to darken everything. We'll have some areas that might start crossing into shiny. So those areas are starting to develop a layer of water on them. But then overall it's just dark. Let's grab a different environment. We want a little more contrast. And base, no wetness, wetness. If we bring all these down, then we'll kind of get to the point where nothing is really getting wet enough for it to get shiny, so it's just damp. So here we go. Let's give this a more real name. I guess it's a filter. And then calculation time. It's like a set of things on. Let's add the water line. So 60-ish, 64 or so. So we'll say an average of 65. While the substance one, the built-in one, is about 70. So it's a little bit faster. We don't have any of the frost parameters, so that's probably part of it. But I think it does a better job of having the material behave the way that it's supposed to. I missed the depth blur in here. Depth blur. Blue. Ugh, can't even type. Okay, this will get organized a little bit better, I think, because this mask's being used multiple times. We need to get some pins and things set up. But yeah, not too bad. So I think I'm going to call it, and maybe we'll work on the snow one next time. I think it depends on how things go with my knee. But thank you guys for tuning in, and hopefully you found this useful, and we'll catch you on the next one.